Have you ever reached a point where nothing is completely wrong, and yet something deep within you feels tired? You wake up, you move through the familiar routines, you answer the messages, you handle what needs to be handled, and from the outside your life may appear perfectly normal. But somewhere beneath all of that activity there is a quiet voice saying, I cannot keep carrying life this way. Maybe you have been feeling that voice lately. Perhaps your mind has become crowded with things that already happened and things that have not happened yet. You replay conversations that ended months ago. You wonder whether you made the wrong choice. You think about the person who disappointed you, the opportunity you lost, the relationship that changed, or the version of yourself you thought you would have become by now. And while your body is standing here in this moment, your attention is somewhere else entirely. This is often where exhaustion begins. Not simply because life has asked too much of you, but because you have been carrying too much of yesterday into today. There comes a time when you may need to reset, restart, and refocus. But perhaps those words mean something very different from what you have been taught. A reset does not necessarily mean changing your job, ending a relationship, moving somewhere new, making a dramatic decision, or becoming a completely different person. Sometimes the deepest reset happens without anyone around you even noticing. It happens when you become willing to stop fighting yourself. It happens when you recognize that the person you were yesterday does not have to control the consciousness you bring into today. And it happens when you remember that beneath your fear, your disappointment, your judgments, and all the stories you have collected about yourself, there is still a quiet presence within you that has never been disturbed by any of them. You may have forgotten that presence, but you have not lost it. Think about the sky during a storm. Dark clouds gather, thunder moves across the horizon. Rain may become so heavy that for a while you cannot see anything beyond it. Yet the sky itself has not disappeared. The clouds are passing through the sky. They are not the sky. Your thoughts can be understood in much the same way. Fear passes through you. Regret passes through you. Anger passes through you. Uncertainty passes through you. Even grief, as deep and sacred as it can be, moves through the landscape of your awareness. But perhaps you are not any of those passing experiences. Perhaps you are the awareness that notices them. And if you can begin to recognize that distinction, something very gentle begins to change. You no longer have to destroy every uncomfortable thought. You no longer have to solve every uncertainty. You no longer have to arrange the entire future before allowing yourself to experience peace. You can simply notice what you have been carrying. Imagine waking tomorrow morning and before remembering everything you believe you must worry about, allowing yourself a few quiet seconds. No past, no future, no argument from yesterday. No imagined conversation tomorrow, just breathing. In that brief silence, who are you? Before your name, your history, your responsibilities, your mistakes, your achievements, your disappointments, and the opinions other people have formed about you, what remains? There is something very peaceful about asking that question without demanding an answer. The ego wants an answer immediately. It wants a definition. It wants to tell you who you are based on what has happened to you. It may say, you are the one who failed, or you are the one who was abandoned, or you are the one who wasted too much time, or perhaps you are the one who must keep everyone happy. And when you accept these descriptions without awareness, you begin carrying them everywhere. A painful experience becomes an identity. A mistake becomes a personality. Someone else's rejection becomes evidence of your worth. A difficult season becomes a prediction of your future. Then one morning you wonder why you feel so heavy. But what if you did not need to repair the person described by all those stories? What if your healing began by realizing that no story can completely contain who you are? This is where a spiritual reset begins. Not by rejecting your past, but by changing your relationship with it. You can look at who you were with, compassion instead of judgment. You can remember the decisions you made when you were afraid and recognize that you were doing what you knew how to do from the awareness you had at that time. You can acknowledge where you caused pain without turning guilt into a permanent identity. You can recognize where others hurt you without allowing resentment to become the room in which you continue to live. Forgiveness begins quietly here. Sometimes the person you most need to forgive is the version of yourself who did not know better. You may look back and say, I should have seen it, perhaps. But you see it now. You may say, I should have left sooner. But you understand that now. You may say, I should never have trusted that person. And yet, perhaps the lesson is not that trusting was foolish. Perhaps the lesson is learning to remain loving without abandoning your own inner wisdom. Awareness changes the meaning of the past. The event remains where it is, but you are no longer standing in the same place within yourself. Consider a tree in late autumn. It does not chase the leaves that fall from its branches. It does not interpret their departure as failure. It releases what the season has completed and stands quietly through the winter. There is wisdom in that image. Your life also has seasons. Some relationships belong to one season. Some dreams belong to another. Some identities that once protected you eventually become too small for you. Even certain beliefs about yourself may have served you once and now quietly ask to be released. The difficulty comes when you try to carry every season with you. You cannot experience spring while insisting that every old leaf remain attached. And perhaps this is why you feel the need to reset. Something inside you knows that you have been holding on. Maybe you are holding on to resentment because you believe letting go means the other person wins. Maybe you are holding on to control because uncertainty frightens you. Maybe you are holding on to an old dream because abandoning it feels like admitting defeat. Maybe you are holding on to an identity built around being needed because you do not yet know who you are when you stop pleasing everyone. There is nothing to condemn in any of this. Simply notice it. Awareness without judgment is already the beginning of freedom. You do not have to rip the old leaves from the branches. When the time is right, they fall because they are no longer being held. The same can happen within you. When you see clearly that resentment is hurting you more than it is protecting you, your grip may begin to soften. When you see that controlling everyone around you has never given you lasting security, you may become willing to trust a little more. When you see that comparison has taken you away from your own path, you may finally stop measuring your life against someone else's journey. This is not weakness. It is a return. You are returning your attention to the only place where life is actually happening here. And perhaps that is what it means to restart. You do not restart by pretending nothing happened. You restart by refusing to make what happened the authority over what happens within you now. The river does not return upstream every morning to correct yesterday's path. It continues toward the ocean. There may be rocks, there may be bends, there may be places where the water moves quickly and places where it seems almost completely still. Yet the river does not argue with its own journey. What would happen if you stopped arguing with yours? What if, just for today, you did not need your past to have been different? What if you allowed yourself to say, that happened, I learned, I felt, I hurt, I grew, and now I am here. There is extraordinary peace hidden inside the words, I am here. Because here is where love is available. Here is where forgiveness becomes possible. Here is where you can choose what receives your attention. Here is where you can remember your connection to something greater than the frightened mind that believes it must control everything. Call it God, call it Source, call it divine intelligence, love, or the quiet mystery from which life arises. The name matters less than the experience of realizing that you are not separate from the life moving through you. Your heartbeat continues without your instruction. Your breath arrives while you sleep. A wound knows how to begin closing itself. The sun rises without your supervision. There is an intelligence moving through existence that does not require your anxiety in order to function. Perhaps you can trust it a little more. And perhaps refocusing is simply learning where to place your attention again. Not on everything you fear losing. Not on everything you wish you could change. Not on proving your worth to people who may never understand your path. But on the quiet presence within you that has been waiting beneath all the noise. You may discover that you do not need to become someone new. You may only need to release enough of what you are, not to remember who you have always been. And as you begin to see this, another question appears. If your past is not your identity, if your fear is not your true voice, and if peace does not depend upon controlling what happens next, then what exactly has been keeping you from beginning again? That is where the journey takes us next. If you begin to look carefully at what has been keeping you from beginning again, you may discover something surprising. It may not be your circumstances. It may not be your age, your past, the people around you, or even the uncertainty of what comes next. Very often, what keeps you stuck is the quiet collection of beliefs you have accepted about what life is supposed to look like and who you are supposed to be within it. This is where the ego becomes important to understand. The ego is not something you need to fight. The moment you declare war on it, you create another conflict inside yourself. It may be more helpful to simply notice it. The ego is that part of the mind that tries to build an identity from comparison, approval, possession, control, and separation. It looks outside of you and asks, Where do I stand? Am I enough? Do they respect me? Am I ahead or behind? What if I lose this? What if they leave? What if life does not happen the way I planned? These questions can become so familiar that you no longer recognize them as questions. They begin to sound like reality. And when fear sounds like reality, you organize your life around protecting yourself from things that have not even happened. You may recognize this in something very ordinary. Perhaps someone you care about becomes quiet. They respond differently to you. Their message is shorter than usual, or they seem emotionally distant. Nothing has actually been explained, but the mind immediately begins creating a story. Something is wrong. Maybe I upset them. Perhaps they no longer care. Maybe I am going to lose this relationship. Within minutes, you can experience the emotional pain of an event that has not occurred. The body responds to the story as though the story were fact. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts accelerate. You begin remembering every previous experience of rejection. You may feel the urge to send another message, demand reassurance, withdraw before you can be hurt, or analyze every word they said. This is not because there is something wrong with you. It is because the ego often believes that uncertainty is dangerous. It would rather create a painful explanation than remain peacefully in the unknown. Awareness gives you another possibility. You can notice the story before becoming the story. You might quietly say, I notice that my mind is afraid of being rejected. That simple shift is profound. You have moved from I am being rejected to I am noticing fear. The fear may still be there. You do not have to force it away. You simply stop giving it the authority to define reality before reality has spoken. This is one of the ways you reset. You create a little space between what happens and what your conditioned mind says it means. In that space, peace becomes possible. The same thing happens with control. There are moments in life when you desperately want to know what comes next. You want certainty about the relationship, the family, your direction, your health, your future, or the people you love. You want life to show you the entire road before you take another step. But life rarely works that way. Think of driving through a quiet road at night. Your headlights do not illuminate the entire journey. They show you only the stretch of road immediately ahead. Yet that is enough to continue. Perhaps your spiritual life works in a similar way. You may not need to see 10 years ahead. You may only need enough light for this moment. The ego says, show me exactly how everything will work out, and then I will trust. The deeper self whispers, trust, and then take the step that is visible. This does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean ignoring wisdom or refusing to make thoughtful choices. It means recognizing the difference between responsible action and the exhausting attempt to control what cannot be controlled. You can choose how honestly you speak. You cannot control how someone receives your honesty. You can offer love. You cannot force another person to return it in the form you expect. You can apologize. You cannot decide when someone forgives you. You can care for someone deeply. You cannot write the entire path of their life. You can listen to your inner guidance. You cannot demand that life reveal every outcome in advance. There is freedom in recognizing these boundaries. Much of emotional exhaustion comes from trying to manage the part of life that was never ours to manage. And then there is comparison. Comparison is one of the most subtle ways the ego pulls you away from yourself. You may be having a perfectly peaceful day until you see someone else's life. Suddenly, your own life seems inadequate. Someone is celebrating a relationship while you are alone. Someone appears to have discovered their purpose while you still feel uncertain. Someone seems confident while you are questioning everything. Someone has reached a stage of life you thought you would have reached by now. And almost without noticing, you leave your own path and enter an imaginary competition. But a tree does not look across the forest and become ashamed because another tree is taller. A rose does not apologize because it did not bloom at the same moment as the flower beside it. Nature does not seem obsessed with sameness. Everything unfolds according to its own expression. Perhaps your life is allowed to do the same. Your timing does not need to resemble someone else's timing to be meaningful. You may be in a season of uncertainty that is teaching you how to listen. You may be in a season of solitude that is helping you rediscover the difference between being alone and being abandoned. You may be in a season of endings that is clearing space for a way of living you cannot yet imagine. When you compare your season with someone else's, you may misinterpret growth as failure. A seed beneath the soil looks like nothing is happening, but life is moving in the darkness. Roots are forming before anything appears above the ground. Perhaps some of the most important changes in you are happening where nobody can see them. The ego wants evidence. The soul is willing to trust the unseen. This becomes especially important when you feel that you should be further along. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from the sentence, "By now I should have." By now I should have figured myself out. By now I should have healed. By now I should know what I want. By now I should have stopped caring what they think. By now I should have forgiven them. But healing does not obey the calendar of the ego. You cannot shame yourself into peace. You cannot criticize yourself into self-love. And you cannot rush your heart through an experience simply because your mind has decided that enough time has passed. What you can do is become present with yourself. Imagine someone you love sitting beside you in pain. Would you look at them and say, "You should have finished grieving by now"? Would you tell them their uncertainty makes them weak? Would you criticize them for needing time? Perhaps you would sit beside them. Perhaps you would listen. Perhaps you would remind them that they do not have to understand everything today. Can you offer yourself that same kindness? This is where awareness begins turning into compassion. And compassion changes the quality of your inner world. You may begin to realize that the voice inside you that constantly criticizes you is not necessarily the voice of truth. It may simply be an old voice you learned somewhere along the way. Perhaps you learned that love had to be earned. Perhaps being useful made you feel safe. Perhaps being agreeable prevented conflict. Perhaps achievement brought approval. Perhaps staying quiet kept other people comfortable. And so you learned to become what the room required. You became skilled at sensing what other people wanted. You learned when to smile, when to say yes, when to hide your disappointment, when to pretend you were not tired, when to avoid saying what you truly felt because you feared becoming difficult, selfish, or unlovable. Eventually, people-pleasing can become so automatic that you lose contact with the simple question, what is true for me? You may say yes while your entire body is asking for rest. You may remain in conversations that drain you because you do not want to disappoint anyone. You may continue proving your goodness to people who have already decided how they will see you. And then you wonder why you feel disconnected from yourself. Sometimes refocusing means bringing your attention home from everyone else's opinion. You do not need to become cold or indifferent. Love does not require self-abandonment. You can care deeply about another person and still allow them to misunderstand you. You can respect someone's feelings without making yourself responsible for every feeling they experience. You can say no without turning the other person into an enemy. You can step away from what repeatedly harms your peace without filling your heart with hatred. This is a very different kind of strength. It does not need to announce itself. It simply stops negotiating with what the deeper self already knows. And perhaps one of the most difficult places to practice this is in relationships where you have been hurt. When someone wounds you, the ego may believe resentment will protect you. It says, do not forget what they did. And there can be wisdom in remembering what an experience taught you. Forgiveness does not require returning to an unsafe pattern. It does not require pretending that trust was never broken. But there is a difference between remembering the lesson and repeatedly reliving the wound. You can learn from the fire without carrying the ashes everywhere. Resentment often creates an invisible relationship with the person who hurt you. They may no longer be in your life, yet they remain in your thoughts. You argue with them in your imagination. You rehearse what you should have said. You hope they eventually understand what they did. You imagine them regretting losing you. And without realizing it, part of your inner peace remains dependent upon their awakening. What if they never understand? What if they never apologize? What if they continue believing their version of the story? Does your peace have to wait? This question can open a door. Forgiveness is not saying what happened was acceptable. Forgiveness may simply mean I am no longer willing to use my present moment to continue suffering over what cannot be changed. That is a reset. You stop asking yesterday to become different. You allow the lesson to remain while the emotional chain begins to loosen. And perhaps you discover something else. Sometimes resentment toward another person hides resentment toward yourself. You may secretly be angry that you stayed, angry that you trusted, angry that you ignored your intuition, angry that you gave too much, angry that you did not speak sooner. This is where self-forgiveness becomes essential. You made choices from the consciousness available to you then. Now you see differently. That is not evidence that you were foolish. It is evidence that awareness has expanded. You do not punish a child for not knowing what only adulthood could teach. Perhaps you can stop punishing an earlier version of yourself for not possessing wisdom that experience had not yet given you. Let that version of you rest. Thank them, if you can, for surviving long enough to bring you here. Then there is fear of the future. Sometimes you release the past only to immediately fill the empty space with anxiety about tomorrow. What if I begin again and fail? What if I trust and get hurt? What if I let go and regret it? What if nothing changes? Notice how often fear begins with two words: what if? The mind travels into an imaginary future and brings back suffering. But the same imagination can ask another question. What if you are being guided? What if this ending is not punishment? What if the empty space is not evidence that something is missing, but an invitation to listen more deeply? What if you do not need to understand this season in order to live it peacefully? You do not need to force yourself to believe that everything will happen exactly as you want. That can become another form of control. Trust is quieter than that. Trust says, whatever comes, I will meet it from the deepest awareness available to me. That is enough. You cannot guarantee that life will never disappoint you. You cannot guarantee that nobody will leave. You cannot guarantee that every plan will unfold. But you can begin trusting that your peace does not have to disappear every time circumstances change. This is a profound shift. Instead of asking life to become peaceful so that you can be peaceful, you begin discovering peace as something you bring to life. And that does not happen perfectly. There will still be days when you react. Days when old fears return. Days when you compare yourself again. Days when you want reassurance. Days when you find yourself replaying the past. The ego may then say, see, nothing has changed. But awareness says, I noticed. That noticing is change. Before, perhaps you could spend 3 days inside a fearful story without recognizing it. Now you may notice after 3 hours. Later, perhaps after 3 minutes. Spiritual growth is not always the disappearance of old patterns. Sometimes it is simply the shortening of the time you remain unconscious inside them. You notice, you breathe, you return. This is why a reset is not something you do once. It is something life continually invites you into. Every breath is a small beginning. Every moment of awareness is a restart. Every time you notice that your attention has wandered into fear and gently bring it back to love, you are refocusing. There is no need to criticize yourself for wandering. Think of meditation. The mind wanders and you return. It wanders again and you return again. The returning is not evidence that you failed at meditation. The returning is the practice. Life may be much the same. You wander into judgment. Return. You wander into comparison. Return. You wander into resentment. Return. You wander into fear about tomorrow. Return. Not through force, through awareness. Return to the breath. Return to this room. Return to what is actually happening instead of what the mind predicts. Return to gratitude for something simple. Return to kindness. Return to the presence beneath the thoughts. And each time you return, you may begin sensing something that was there all along. There is a part of you that is not competing. It is not asking whether you are ahead or behind. It is not obsessed with being admired. It does not need to win every argument. It does not need the past to change. It does not demand certainty about tomorrow. It simply is. You might call this your true self. You might experience it as consciousness, spirit, presence, or your connection with the source. The label is not important. What matters is that you recognize the difference between the noise that passes through you and the awareness that notices the noise. Imagine the ocean. At the surface, there may be waves, storms, wind, and constant movement, but travel deeper and the water becomes quieter. Your mind often lives at the surface. Every opinion becomes a wave. Every notification becomes a wave. Every memory becomes a wave. Every uncertainty becomes a wave. And because you are watching the surface constantly, you may conclude that you are the storm. But there is depth within you. There is a place where you do not need to solve yourself. There is a place where you do not need anyone's approval to exist. There is a place where the question is no longer, how do I make everyone understand me? But rather, can I understand myself with enough compassion that I no longer need to fight for permission to be who I am? This is where refocusing becomes spiritual. You begin moving attention away from the surface and toward the depth. You become less interested in proving and more interested in being. Less interested in controlling and more interested in aligning. Less interested in asking, what can I get from life, and more interested in asking, what quality of presence am I bringing to this moment? Am I bringing fear? Am I bringing resentment? Am I bringing the need to be right? Or can I bring a little more love? Not because love guarantees that everyone will treat you well, but because love keeps you connected to who you are. There may be people who cannot meet you there. You can still release them without hatred. There may be situations that must end. You can let them end without deciding that your life has ended with them. There may be questions that remain unanswered. You can carry the question without allowing it to become anxiety. There may be dreams that change. You can bless the old dream and listen for what life is asking of you now. This is what it means to move beyond the ego, not to destroy it, not to become spiritually perfect, simply to stop letting fear make every decision, to notice when the old identity speaks and remember that you have another place from which to live. And once you begin living from that deeper place, the question changes. You no longer ask only, what should I let go of? You begin asking, what am I returning to? Because letting go is only half of the journey. You release the resentment, but what fills the space? You loosen your grip on control, but what do you trust instead? You stop seeking approval, but where does your sense of worth come from? You stop carrying yesterday, but how do you meet today? The answer may not be found in becoming more impressive, more certain, or more protected. It may be found in returning to the quiet center within you, where forgiveness becomes possible, where love does not depend on agreement, where intention becomes more powerful than fear, and where you remember that you were never truly separated from the source of life. And that return may be the deepest restart of all. And perhaps the deepest question now is not what you are leaving behind, but what you are returning to. Because when you release an old resentment, loosen your need for control, or stop defining yourself through someone else's approval, an open space appears within you. At first, that space may feel unfamiliar. You may even mistake it for emptiness. The mind has been so accustomed to carrying something that when the burden is removed, it does not immediately know what to do with the freedom. This is why returning to your true self can feel strange before it feels peaceful. You may have spent years thinking about what other people need from you. You may have built your identity around being strong, dependable, agreeable, successful, needed, or understood. Perhaps you learned to measure your worth through the responses you receive from others. And then, when you finally stop asking the outside world to tell you who you are, there can be a quiet moment when you wonder, then who am I? Do not rush to answer. There is something beautiful about allowing that question to remain open. The ego wants to replace one identity with another immediately. It wants a new label, a new story, a new definition. But your deeper self may not need a label. It may be experienced rather than explained. Think of sunlight entering a room. The light does not announce itself. It does not explain why it belongs there. It simply illuminates what is present. Perhaps your true nature is something like that. It is the awareness that remains when you stop performing. It is the quiet kindness that appears when you are no longer defending yourself. It is the compassion that allows you to look at your past without turning it into a courtroom. It is the stillness that reminds you that you are connected to something larger than the restless thoughts passing through your mind. And one of the doors into that stillness is forgiveness. Forgiveness is often misunderstood because we imagine it as something we give to the person who hurt us. We think forgiving means excusing what happened, forgetting the lesson, reopening a door that needed to close, or pretending that pain did not matter. But forgiveness can be something much more intimate. It can be the moment you decide that your heart no longer needs to remain organized around an old injury. Imagine carrying a stone everywhere you go because someone once threw it at you. You carry it to remind yourself what happened. You carry it because you believe putting it down would somehow make the event less real. Years pass, and the person who threw it may be gone, yet your hand remains closed around the stone. Eventually, you might ask, who is carrying this weight now? The answer is you. Putting it down does not change history. It changes what history is allowed to weigh in the present. Perhaps there is someone whose name still creates tension inside you. Maybe they betrayed your trust. Maybe they left without giving you the explanation you needed. Maybe they said something you have never forgotten. Perhaps they were supposed to love you differently. You may have imagined many times what they should say if they ever returned. I was wrong. You deserve better. I finally understand. And perhaps they will say those words one day, but perhaps they will not. If your freedom depends on their awakening, you have placed the key to your inner peace in someone else's hands. What if you gently took it back? You do not have to say that what happened was right. You might simply say within yourself, I no longer require this person to become different in order for me to become peaceful. There is enormous freedom in that. The same forgiveness may need to be extended toward yourself. For many people, beginning again is difficult because they are still punishing themselves for an earlier chapter. Maybe you stayed where you were not valued. Maybe you walked away from someone you now wish you had understood better. Maybe fear made a decision for you. Maybe you ignored your own inner knowing because you desperately wanted something to work. Maybe you spent years seeking approval from people who could never give you the love you were seeking. And now, with the clarity you have today, you look backward and judge the person you were then. But awareness can invite a different response. Imagine meeting that earlier version of yourself, not as a judge, as a friend. See that person standing before you with the fears they carried then, the information they had then, the wounds they had not yet understood, and the longing to be loved that may have influenced choices they could not fully see. Would you condemn them? Or might you place a hand on their shoulder and say, you did not know everything yet, but you brought me here. There is a softness that enters the heart when you stop using wisdom gained through experience as a weapon against the person who had to live through the experience to gain it. You know more now because you walked through something. Let the lesson remain. Let the punishment end. This is not avoiding responsibility. In fact, responsibility becomes clear when shame is removed. You can acknowledge that you made a mistake without saying, I am a mistake. You can recognize that you caused pain without deciding that you are unworthy of love. You can apologize where an apology is possible, repair what can be repaired, and still refuse to spend the rest of your life kneeling before yesterday. The source within you is not keeping a list of every moment you failed to be perfect. Perhaps life is inviting you to learn, awaken, and return. A river does not condemn itself for taking a wrong turn around a stone. It simply keeps moving toward the sea. You can keep moving too. And as forgiveness loosens the grip of the past, surrender begins loosening your grip on the future. Surrender can sound frightening because the ego interprets it as defeat. It imagines surrender means giving up, becoming passive, or allowing life to happen without discernment. But spiritual surrender can mean something entirely different. It can mean giving up the belief that your peace requires life to obey your plan. There is a difference between having an intention and demanding an outcome. You may intend to love deeply. You may intend to speak honestly. You may intend to live peacefully. You may intend to listen more closely to your inner wisdom. But the moment you say, life must unfold exactly this way or I cannot be at peace, intention has quietly become attachment. And attachment creates fear because everything you demand from life becomes something you are afraid to lose. You see this in relationships. You meet someone you love, and love itself feels spacious. You enjoy their presence. You appreciate who they are. You feel grateful that your paths have crossed. Then fear enters. What if they leave? What if they change? What if I am not enough? And suddenly love becomes an attempt to secure the future. You begin reading every change in tone. You need reassurance. You become afraid of space. You may try to control what was beautiful precisely because it became important to you. But love and possession are not the same. Love says, I am grateful that you are here. Fear says, promise me you will never change. Love allows another person to have a soul of their own. Fear tries to make their choices responsible for your inner stability. Perhaps loving more deeply sometimes requires holding more gently. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop asking another person to carry the responsibility for completing you. When you remember your own connection to the source, you can meet relationships from fullness rather than hunger. You can say, I love you, without secretly meaning, please prove that I am worthy. You can listen without preparing a defense. You can offer affection without turning it into a transaction. And if a relationship must change, you can grieve it without believing that love itself has abandoned you. This may be one of the great spiritual lessons hidden inside loss. Forms change. People come and go. Children grow. Parents age. Friendships shift. Bodies change. Homes change. Dreams change. Seasons turn. The ego sees impermanence and says, hold tighter. The deeper self may whisper, love more fully while it is here. Think about a sunset. Part of its beauty is that you cannot keep it. You cannot demand that the sky remain exactly as it is because you like these colors. You experience it, you receive it, and then you allow evening to come. Perhaps much of life asks for the same grace: to receive without possessing, to love without imprisoning, to appreciate without demanding permanence. And when something leaves, to trust that the love you experienced was not meaningless simply because its form changed. This kind of surrender is not easy. It asks you to live without guarantees. But you have always lived without guarantees. The difference is whether you spend your days fighting that truth or allowing it to deepen your gratitude. When you know that a moment will not last forever, you may finally become present enough to experience it. You look more closely at the face of someone you love. You listen instead of waiting to speak. You notice the morning light on the wall. You appreciate your body for carrying you through another day rather than criticizing everything about it. You call someone while there is still time. You forgive a little sooner. You say thank you more often. Gratitude begins to replace entitlement. And gratitude is a powerful way of refocusing your attention. The ego is naturally drawn toward what is missing. It notices the unanswered message before the 10 people who care. It notices the door that closed before the ones that remain open. It notices the part of your body that has changed before the miracle of breath moving through it. It notices the dream that did not happen and overlooks the life quietly happening around you. Gratitude does not ask you to deny what hurts. You can be grateful and grieving. You can be grateful and uncertain. You can be grateful while something important is ending. Gratitude simply widens your vision so that pain is no longer the only thing you can see. Imagine standing beneath the night sky and focusing on one dark space between the stars. If you stare only at that darkness, you may say there is nothing there. But widen your gaze. There is light everywhere. Perhaps refocusing is not creating a different life. Perhaps it is learning to see the life that fear has prevented you from noticing. And from that awareness, intention begins to take on a new meaning. Intention is not merely deciding what you want to get. It can be deciding how you want to meet life. Before entering a difficult conversation, you can ask, what energy do I want to bring into this room? Before responding to someone who has upset you, you can ask, do I want fear to speak through me, or can I wait until I am able to speak from clarity? Before beginning your morning, you can quietly choose, today, let me notice where I abandon my peace. This kind of intention is inward. It does not attempt to manipulate the universe. It aligns you with the qualities you wish to embody: peace, kindness, patience, truth, compassion, love. When your intention becomes alignment rather than acquisition, you stop measuring every day by what you obtained. You begin noticing who you were while you lived it. Perhaps the traffic was difficult, but you practiced patience. Perhaps someone criticized you, but you did not allow their anger to become yours. Perhaps an old memory returned. But instead of drowning in it, you placed your hand over your heart and said, that was then, I am here now. Perhaps nothing dramatic happened at all, and yet you were present. A quiet day lived consciously may contain more spiritual transformation than a dramatic day spent unconsciously. This is why you do not have to wait for a major event to reconnect with your true self. The sacred can appear in very ordinary places: while washing dishes, while walking alone, while sitting beside someone who needs to be heard, while drinking water slowly, while watching rain, while turning off the noise and allowing yourself 5 minutes of silence. The source does not require a special location. If the divine presence is everywhere, then it must also be here, in this breath, in this room, in the imperfect life you are living today. You do not have to travel somewhere else to find what has never been separate from you. Sometimes people spend years searching for spiritual awakening as though it were an achievement waiting at the end of a difficult path. But perhaps awakening is less about acquiring something and more about noticing what you have been too distracted to see. The peace beneath the thought, the awareness beneath the identity, the love beneath the defense, the stillness beneath the constant need to become. There is a quiet irony here. You may have spent much of your life trying to become worthy enough to feel whole. And the spiritual journey may eventually reveal that wholeness was never something you had to earn. You were simply covering it with beliefs about who you needed to become. This is why silence can feel so healing. When you sit quietly, the first thing you may encounter is not peace. You may encounter noise, plans, memories, regrets, imaginary conversations, things you forgot to do, things you wish you had said. Do not assume this means silence is not working. Perhaps you are simply becoming aware of how much noise was already there. Let it pass. Thoughts can be like birds crossing the sky. You do not have to follow each one to wherever it is going. A thought appears, what if I never figure my life out? You notice it. Another thought appears, I should have made a different choice. You notice that too. You do not have to argue. You do not have to believe. You remain. Eventually, there may be small spaces between the thoughts. And in those spaces, something feels familiar, not exciting, not dramatic, familiar, almost like coming home. This may be why the deepest spiritual truths sometimes feel less like learning and more like remembering. You remember that peace was never entirely outside you. You remember that another person's opinion cannot alter the essence of who you are. You remember that your past is a chapter, not the consciousness reading the chapter. You remember that love feels more natural than resentment, even when forgiveness takes time. You remember that you belong to life, rather than standing outside it trying to control it. And perhaps you remember that you have never taken a single breath alone. The same intelligence that opens flowers and moves tides is moving through your body in this moment. You do not have to understand that intelligence intellectually to feel wonder toward it. Consider how little you consciously control. You do not tell your heart when to beat. You do not instruct every cell how to function. You do not command the earth to rotate. You do not tell spring when to arrive. Life has been moving with a wisdom far beyond the planning mind. And yet the ego says, if I stop worrying, everything may fall apart. What if worry was never holding the universe together? What if you could put some of that burden down? There is a difference between caring and worrying. Caring may guide you toward loving action. Worry often circles the same uncertainty without moving anywhere. Caring asks, what can I lovingly do now? Worry asks, how can I mentally control what has not happened? One leads you into presence. The other carries you away from it. When you notice yourself worrying, perhaps you can gently ask, is there something I can do in this moment? If there is, do it with awareness. If there is not, perhaps this moment is asking for trust. Trust does not mean knowing that everything will happen according to your preference. Trust may mean knowing that you do not have to abandon yourself when it does not. You can remain connected to the source in uncertainty. You can remain loving when a plan changes. You can remain present while waiting for an answer. You can experience disappointment without turning disappointment into your identity. This is inner freedom. It is not freedom from every difficult experience. It is freedom from the belief that every difficult experience must remove your peace. Imagine a tree during strong wind. Its branches move. Its leaves tremble. It does not remain rigid. Its ability to bend is part of what allows it to remain rooted. Perhaps spiritual strength is not becoming unmoved by life. Perhaps it is becoming deeply rooted enough that you can move with life without losing yourself. Your roots are not your possessions. They are not your reputation. They are not your plans. They are not even the people you love, because those people have their own journeys. Your deepest root is your connection with the source. When you remember that connection, change becomes less threatening. You can lose a role without losing your essence. You can leave a chapter without leaving yourself. You can grow older without believing that your value is fading. You can watch your appearance change while discovering something within you that was never dependent upon appearance. Aging itself can become a spiritual teacher. The ego may resist every sign that time is passing. It wants to preserve the image it once knew. But the deeper self may recognize aging as another invitation to release identification with form. A tree in winter is not less sacred because its spring blossoms are gone. Its beauty has changed. Perhaps yours can too. There is a kind of beauty that comes from having forgiven. A beauty in eyes that have cried and softened rather than hardened. A beauty in someone who no longer needs to impress the room. A beauty in becoming comfortable with silence. A beauty in realizing that you do not need to be young forever to remain fully alive. Every season carries its own invitation. And perhaps the season you are in now is asking you to stop wishing yourself backward or rushing yourself forward. Be here. This is where your life is. This is where the source meets you. Not yesterday. Not when everything is resolved. Here. And when you truly begin living from here, you may notice that the reset you were searching for has already begun. You did not need to erase your history. You needed to stop living inside it. You did not need certainty about the future. You needed to stop abandoning the present for an imagined tomorrow. You did not need everyone to understand you. You needed to remember the place within you that does not require their permission. You did not need to become someone else. You needed to come home. And now the question becomes beautifully practical. How do you carry this awareness into an ordinary Tuesday morning? How do you remember it when someone irritates you, when an old wound returns, when uncertainty appears again, or when the world becomes noisy? Perhaps the final part of this journey is learning how to live what you have remembered quietly and imperfectly, one present moment at a time. So how do you carry this awareness into an ordinary day? How do you remember who you are when the morning becomes busy, when someone disappoints you, when an old fear suddenly returns, or when life once again refuses to follow the plan you had carefully created? Perhaps you begin by releasing the expectation that you must remember perfectly. There will be mornings when you wake with peace, and there will be mornings when your mind begins worrying before your feet touch the floor. There will be days when forgiveness feels natural and days when an old wound suddenly feels fresh again. There will be moments when you trust life deeply, followed by moments when you want guarantees. None of this means you have lost your way. The practice is simply returning. Before reaching for the noise of the world in the morning, you might give yourself a few moments of silence. Feel the breath entering and leaving your body. Notice that life has already begun before you have done anything to deserve it. Your heart is beating. Morning has arrived. Another moment has been given to you. You do not have to immediately carry yesterday into it. You might quietly ask yourself, what am I willing to leave behind today? Perhaps it is resentment. Perhaps it is the need to prove something. Perhaps it is an argument you have continued long after the conversation ended. Perhaps it is the belief that you are behind. You do not need to force these things away. Simply become aware of them. Sometimes awareness loosens what struggle only tightens. Then ask another question. What would I like to bring into this day? Maybe the answer is patience. Maybe kindness. Maybe trust. Maybe the intention to listen more deeply. Maybe simply peace. This is refocusing. You are not trying to control what the day will bring. You are deciding what quality of presence you would like to bring to the day. And when you forget, return. If someone says something that activates an old wound, notice what happens before allowing the wound to speak for you. Feel the reaction in your body. Give yourself one breath, perhaps two. Remember that you do not have to turn every disturbance into a battle. Sometimes peace is found in the small space between being triggered and responding. Sometimes love is simply choosing not to add more pain to pain. And sometimes love means speaking clearly, setting a boundary, or walking away without hatred. Inner peace does not require you to become passive. It invites you to act without allowing fear to become the source of your action. Throughout the day, gratitude can help bring you home. Not forced gratitude. Not pretending everything is wonderful when your heart is hurting. Simply notice what is still here. The warmth of sunlight, a glass of water, someone who remembered you, the sound of a familiar voice, the ability to breathe deeply, a quiet room, a tree moving in the wind. There is something sacred about allowing ordinary things to become enough for a moment. The ego is constantly waiting for something significant to happen before it gives you permission to feel fulfilled. But life is mostly made of small moments. If you overlook them while waiting for the extraordinary, you may overlook your life. And when something difficult happens, perhaps you can practice another quiet question. Can I meet this without immediately deciding what it means? A closed door does not always mean rejection. A delay does not always mean failure. An ending does not always mean something has gone wrong. A season of uncertainty does not mean you have been abandoned by life. Sometimes you will understand the meaning of an experience only after you have stopped demanding an explanation. Trust allows the unanswered question to remain unanswered for a while. At the end of the day, you might spend a few moments forgiving. Forgive the person who irritated you if you are ready. Forgive the stranger who was impatient. Forgive the person who did not respond as you hoped. And especially, forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for the moment you reacted instead of responding. Forgive yourself for worrying again. Forgive yourself for comparing. Forgive yourself for forgetting everything you thought you had learned. You are learning through remembering and forgetting, wandering and returning. A wave rises and falls, yet it never stops belonging to the ocean. Perhaps you are like that. Even in the moments when you feel disconnected from the source, perhaps the separation exists only in your awareness. You never stop belonging. You simply forgot. And every moment gives you another opportunity to remember. This is why your reset does not require a particular date. You do not need Monday. You do not need a new month. You do not need a new year. You do not need life to become easier first. The next conscious breath can be your reset. The next loving thought can be your restart. The next moment in which you withdraw attention from fear and return it to peace can be your refocus. It can happen now. And perhaps this is the beautiful simplicity beneath everything we have explored together. You do not need to erase your past. Let it become wisdom. You do not need to know your entire future. Let the next step reveal itself. You do not need to make everyone understand you. Let your life become an expression of what you understand within yourself. You do not need to force forgiveness. Simply stop feeding the wound whenever you are able. You do not need to eliminate fear. Learn to recognize that fear does not have to lead you. You do not need to become worthy of peace. Peace is what begins to appear when you stop arguing with who you are. Maybe you came here believing that you needed to rebuild your entire life. Perhaps what you needed was much gentler. To stop, to listen, to release, to remember. Imagine standing beside a river at sunset. The water continues moving. Everything that passed this morning is already downstream. The river does not reach backward to retrieve it, and neither must you. Yesterday has completed itself. Whatever happened, whatever you said, whatever they said, whatever you lost, whatever you wish you could change, it belongs to the part of the river that has already passed. You are here. This breath is here. This moment is here. And the source of life is here. You can begin from this place, not as someone who has never been hurt, but as someone who no longer needs pain to define them. Not as someone who knows exactly what comes next, but as someone willing to trust the unfolding. Not as someone who has conquered the ego forever, but as someone who can recognize its voice and gently choose again. Not as someone who has become spiritually perfect, but as someone who remembers how to return home. There may come another difficult season. There may be another goodbye, another uncertainty, another moment when life asks you to release something you thought would remain forever. And when that happens, perhaps you will remember that trees release their leaves without losing their roots. The ocean allows every wave to rise and fall without becoming less complete. The sky allows storms to pass without becoming the storm. And you can allow life to move through you without losing the quiet presence beneath it all. That presence is still here. It was there before the disappointment. It was there beneath the anxiety. It was there while you were searching everywhere outside yourself for an answer. It has been waiting without judgment. Perhaps you were never truly trying to become someone new. Perhaps you were simply trying to remember the person beneath the fear. So reset, not because you are broken, but because you are ready to release what has become too heavy. Restart, not because your past was meaningless, but because it has already given you what it came to teach. Refocus, not because you must chase a better life, but because your attention has wandered away from the peace that has always been available within you. And then continue gently, one breath, one choice, one act of forgiveness, one moment of gratitude, one return to love. Let that be enough. If something in this journey has reminded you of what you are ready to release, you may share that reflection in the comments. Sometimes putting a realization into words helps us see it more clearly, and your reflection may quietly remind someone else that they are not alone. And if these conversations help you return to the peaceful place within yourself, you can subscribe and continue these spiritual journeys with us. But before you move on to whatever comes next in your day, remain here for just one more breath. You do not need to carry everything with you. Let yesterday rest. Let tomorrow arrive when it arrives. And meet this moment as you are. Because beneath all the noise, beneath every role, every fear, every regret, and every story you have ever told about yourself, there is still a quiet presence within you. It has not gone anywhere. It has not abandoned you. It does not need to be created. It only needs to be remembered. And perhaps in remembering it now, you have already begun again.